we're going to be talking about right-wing militias yesterday and today. First things first, major content warning. This presentation will contain racist and anti-Semitic visual material and descriptions of graphic violence. The presentation will be about 20 minutes, so if you're uncomfortable and don't want to observe the presentation, that's fine. You can mute and just step away for about 20 minutes, get some coffee, whatever, and then we'll be back. So just want to get that out there first. And now we will begin.
All right, so starting looking at the history of some right-wing paramilitary groups, we're going to start with the Sturmabteilung, or known better as the SA, or the brown shirts or stormtroopers in Nazi Germany. They were the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. They were founded around in the early 1920s, and they played a major role in Hitler's rise to power. They were very prominent in terms of serving security at Nazi Party events and intimidating political rivals such as the German Communist Party and Social Democrats, as well as Jewish people, Romani people, and trade unionists. They were also primarily made up of more lower class members of German society and disproportionately unemployed, to contrast the SS, which was primarily middle class. And they also kind of served as the Strasserite wing of the Nazi Party. The word socialist was introduced into their party against Hitler's recommendation to try to appeal to the working class. And actually a lot of the SA recruits were ex-communists, so they were kind of roped in by the inclusion of that word.
All right, so what I want to do now is I want to introduce how we get to the contemporary right-wing militia moment that we find ourselves in 2020. So the U.S. paramilitary movements, like the SA, tend to draw support from the working class, but have primarily rallied around a mix of white supremacists and extreme libertarian political ideologies. And you can see this in their predecessors. So in the 1840s, you have the emergence of the Christian identity movement, which is sort of an absurd premise, but the idea is that the 10 northern tribes of Israel migrated to the Caucasus and became white people, so white people are actually the true nation of Israel. It's as anti-Semitic as it sounds. You then have this, this sort of white supremacy being militarized in the 1860s by the KKK, which would emerge two more times in the 1920s and the 1950s. And in 1960 with Posse Comitatus, which was a explicitly Christian identity militia movement. You also have the libertarian notion of the sovereign citizen, or the sovereign citizen movement, which emerges first in 1971, which is an idea that people have that they can basically through public declaration free themselves from the federal government. So usually they like burn their social security card and stop paying income tax and declare themselves free from the federal government. So following this, you have the first wave of militia activity, which really sparks up, or the first wave of contemporary militia activity, which sparks up in the 1990s. This is triggered by two failed ATF marshals and FBI sieges. First at Ruby Ridge, which ended in the death of 3 people and 1 dog. And the second at Waco, which ended in a massive fire that killed 76 people, including 25 children. In response to this, you have this sort of burgeoning mid-90s militia movement epitomized by groups like the Michigan Militia, which is probably most famous because it was a group regularly attended by Timothy McVeigh in the period immediately before the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which took 168 lives. Starting around 2000, during the Bush presidency, you have a lull in militia activity. They're still building, but mostly underground. Things come really above ground in 2008 with the financial crash, and again, because of the white supremacist roots, the election of Barack Obama, the first Black president, really triggers an enlivening of these groups. So you see rapid forming of different groups. You have the 3 Percenters, a right-wing militia with a libertarian ideology explicitly formed in reaction to Obama. You have the Oath Keepers in 2009, a group that's simultaneously constitutionalist and anti-government, however you do that, and it primarily recruits military, police, and first responders. You then, in 2014, things hit big again, where you have the Bundy standoff, in resistance to the Bureau of Land Management, which was a 17-day standoff, followed in 2016 by the occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge for a month and a half, and that resulted in 1 death. In 2016, you have Patriot Prayer, which is a right-wing movement that frames itself as a free speech movement and is particularly associated with the Proud Boys, and we'll talk more about the Proud Boys later. Lastly, I just want to look at 2 examples of how this has manifested in contemporary violence. The first is the Glenn Jones suicide bombing, who was an anti-government sovereign citizen activist who turned on one of his co-conspirators and suicide bombed his house in Nevada. The other was the Cesar Sayoc mail bombings, where he mailed 16 pipe bombs to prominent DNC politicians and other Trump critics in 2019. With the history of the SA and the US paramilitaries in mind, let's compare 2 examples of right-wing street violence to see what this looks like actually on the ground.
So one case that really drew my attention when researching the essay was the tragic murder of Conrad Peterzuk. And that took place in 1932 in August. Conrad Peterzuk was an unemployed man. He was 35 years old, and he was killed by a large group of SA members in his home in front of his mother. And this came after a long string of violence by the SA against communists and Jews. The Nazis at this point were the top party, but they were not yet the ruling party, but so they were very powerful still at the time. 9 men were arrested for the murder, and they included innkeepers and municipal administrators, but also minors and people of the lower class. So 5 of the attackers were given the death penalty, including their leader, Paul Lockman. And when this verdict was brought down, they immediately reacted by crying out, "Down with the justice system," and things like that. And they started immediately framing this as an act of injustice. So Nazi party members reacted by protesting and rioting in the streets, particularly going after Jewish businesses. Hitler released a statement defending the attackers and attacking the government. Prominent Nazi party members went and visited them in prison. Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda master, even released some propaganda related to it that said things like the Jews are guilty, even though there was no Jewish people involved in the incident at all. So the killers were immediately turned into martyrs. There was even this like cringy Nazi poem written about them. And Peterzuk was immediately smeared as a communist and a Polish insurgent. There was one writer who said that he had long ago forfeited his right to live on German soil, all kinds of nasty, terrible things like that. And because of the unrest and fear of causing more unrest, German Chancellor von Papen eventually caved, and their sentence was changed to life imprisonment. And then eventually, when the Nazis took power, the attackers were released from prison and never faced any justice for this brutal murder, which you can see the autopsy report from on screen. It was not a pretty sight. So moving to the future.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm going to be talking about the Kyle Rittenhouse case, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So on August 25th of this year, Kyle Rittenhouse, here in the green shirt with the white baseball cap, he was there at the protests in Kenosha that were protesting the death of Jacob Blake. And 17-year-old Kyle here shot and killed these 2 protesters. We have Anthony Huber, who was 26 and left behind a partner and stepdaughter. He was an avid skateboarder, and the hashtag Skate for Huber movement started in his honor. Then there was Joseph Rosenbaum, 36 years old, who leaves behind his fiancée and 2-year-old daughter. And it's important to note that both of these victims were immediately smeared by right-wing media outlets for their criminal records and so forth, which, as we've learned, is a very common tactic in these murders, frankly. And so Rittenhouse was from out of state, Illinois, and he was using an illegal firearm. He was charged with first-degree murder for these, and he claimed self-defense. And he received a lot of mainstream support from Tucker Carlson and Coulter and even President Trump. Rittenhouse has further been lionized by the Proud Boys and other white supremacist groups for the killings that he carried out. And a Christian crowdfunding website raised over $500,000 for his legal fees. An internal memo from Homeland Security instructed personnel to give sympathetic answers about Rittenhouse in press briefings and so forth. So as we can see, that this fits very, it fits very neatly with this broader history of mainstream right-wing parties and movements supporting violent and frankly murderous right-wing militia activity. Now we're going to get into how this is further legitimized through another historical example.
All right, so as we think about the way that political parties tend to work together with these paramilitary movements, I want to start again with the SA and their relationship to the Nazi Party. So the SA was closely tied to the early Nazi leadership and was originally formed to provide security at Nazi events after socialist and communist protesters began disrupting their meetings. Nevertheless, the SA was officially, sort of in scare quotes, officially separated from the Nazi Party. This is particularly starting in 1924, when there was a ban on public Nazi political organizing in response to Hitler's failed coup of 1923. This official distance not only permitted the organization to grow during this time when Nazi organizing was technically illegal, it also provided plausible deniability. And I think this is the really key idea here. Plausible deniability for the party regarding the constant intimidation, street fighting, and hate violence perpetrated by the SA. Even when Hitler would later assume supreme control over the organization in 1930, its second-in-command, Ernst Röhm, who you can see in the picture here, kept it completely independent of the larger Nazi power structure. While beneficial to the Nazi Party, this official difference also left the SA vulnerable. In 1934, due to the complex variety of factors, including Röhm not getting along with other Nazi leadership, its sort of quasi-Strasserite economic politics, and tensions with the German army, the SA leadership, including Ernst Röhm, was massacred in what was called the Night of the Long Knives. This ambiguous status is not unique to the SA. Right-wing paramilitaries often lack any official relation to the sort of official right-wing parties. And this permits these governing parties to unofficially support their actions while maintaining plausible deniability. You can see a similar pattern emerging in the US.
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the Proud Boys now, an organization, again, I'm sure a lot of you are at least somewhat familiar with. I sure hope so. They are a male-only and, in their own words, Western chauvinist organization founded by Gavin McInnes in the bottom right corner here, looking particularly ghoulish. And here he is actually speaking at the Metropolitan Republican Club in Manhattan, New York City 2 years ago, October 2 years ago. A lot of you may be familiar with this situation. So he was invited to speak, and it was said that the Metropolitan Republican Club promotes people and ideas of all kinds from the right, and that they would never invite anyone who would incite violence. However, while at the club, he and a fellow Proud Boy, an employee of his, reenacted the live on television murder of the Japanese Socialist Party leader by an ultranationalist in 1960. This was, it led to a complete devastation of the Japanese anti-capitalist and socialist movement as to how to respond. And Gavin McInnes, unsurprisingly, called it an inspiring moment. And he called the audience at the Metropolitan Club to never let evil take hold. So it's pretty obvious that he is calling for engaging in violence with the anti-capitalist left. It's pretty clear from what he's saying there. And so obviously, given the historical examples and just how these struggles work, the event was protested by anti-fascist and anti-racist demonstrators, and Proud Boys began beating them up. The men in the background here are the Proud Boys who were there at the event. So these are the men who beat up some of those protesters. They're doing the whole like white supremacist hand signal and so forth. And the other thing to note is that while they were doing this violence, they were often using homophobic and xenophobic language, which further shows this sort of Western male chauvinist ideology of theirs. And as part of the legitimization of the Proud Boys, they received sympathetic coverage from Fox News, while at the same time recruiting racist skinheads and other violent reactionaries. They're willing to engage in political violence in support of Trump. You can see on this image here, this is some mural in Brooklyn that's like anti-Trump. I think it's supposed to be all the lies he said in office or something. And it's spray painted with "Vote Trump or Die," and the words we all now know: "Stand back and stand by." So the Proud Boys are willing to engage in political violence in support of Trump. And this is best epitomized through the slogan of theirs, "F around and find out." Which again appeals to this hypermasculine domination over others and a willingness to find any excuse to be violent. Furthermore, at the Metropolitan Republican Club, McGinnis called for the mainstream GOP to let us scum in, an acknowledgement that they are just like street level violent thugs, effectively. Wrong, weird choice of words there, forgive me. And again, further legitimized through the announcement at the debate with Joe Biden. And in these ways, the GOP is able to provide unofficial dog whistle support for these right-wing extremist movements without officially recognizing that they are together somehow. So what are these right-wing violent movements and militias up to now?
So this is something that happened rather recently in the news that a lot of you are probably aware of, but if you aren't, and to gain more details on it, there was recently a plot to kidnap and possibly murder the governor of the state of Michigan. So Michigan is historically a site of some of the most blatant right-wing militia work in 2020, and historically, Justin mentioned the Michigan militia that had Timothy McVeigh involved with them earlier. So on May 1st, there was a demonstration at the State House that was dubbed the American Patriot Rally and included armed militia members entering the State House. And this was in protest of the stay-at-home orders related to the pandemic that were going on at the time. And President Trump threw his support behind the demonstrators, even going so far as tweeting the phrase, "Liberate Michigan." So this was taken to heart, and about a week later, militia groups stormed the Idaho state capitol. At the same time, at least 14 members and associates of the Wolverine Watchman militia group plan to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, with the aim of triggering a civil war. They also considered Virginia Governor Ralph Northam as a potential target. So they staked out her vacation home with night vision goggles and had plans to detonate an explosive device to distract police during the kidnapping. Thankfully, their plot was foiled by authorities, but unfortunately, there's already been attempts to smear Whitmer and either excuse the kidnapping or paint them as somehow actually left-wing. So that is what these fine gentlemen have been up to today. And so to wrap up, we're going to move to a Q&A session now. So
yeah, I guess we'll keep it up to stack for like 5 minutes or so. I don't know what, yeah.
I know we had one question that was somebody posted in the chat while we were talking, which was the question we referenced a few times, the Strasserite, the sort of quasi-Strasseriteness of the essay. The best way to think of Strasserites is that they're looking for sort of quasi-socialist economic policies. So the essay wanted to wanted to basically seize land from the aristocracy, shut down multinational corporation, things along those lines. So it's like kind of quasi-socialist economics, but mixed together with the sort of racism, xenophobia, and all of those things of the Nazis. And so they want those economic policies, but for generally pretty explicitly racist reasons.
Next, we have Jennifer on stack.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you had thoughts about the reclaimability of these words, and I'm specifically interested in the fact that recently there was a movement to take over the Proud Boys hashtag with pictures of gay men together, and it was a bit difficult in the queer community because a lot of it was white men not sort of realizing, I think, what they were jumping onto. But I wondered if there's any sort of experience with historically taking over these groups, shifting, like disrupting them, etc.
So I know off the top of my head, there are, and I can't remember his name, but there are like former skinheads who leave those organizations and like put a lot of their both professional and like activist work involved in like sort of like meeting these young men before they even get involved. I can do a bit more like research and get like more hard, like concrete sources and share them on like Stack or something, because that's the first one that comes to mind. But as for like actively infiltrating these movements, like with the Twitter handle campaign you were talking about, Jenny, which I actually saw a lot of those images when I was looking for photos for this presentation.
Oh, nice.
So like, I guess that shows something, but I don't really know too much beyond that. Obviously, given their willingness and propensity to be murderous and kill people, there's a very, very high risk. I do know that the FBI and feds often go undercover in these organizations, though, but we need to take that with a significant grain of salt, too.
And something that I was going to mention that it looks like Zachary Tolbert already hit in the chat is there are, organizations like the John Brown Gun Club or the SRA that are trying to, change the culture around, gun firearm spaces and make it, less toxically masculine, more inclusive, more focused on, safety and community defense. So I think organizations like that are very powerful, especially for, getting people involved who might otherwise be drawn to some of those more toxic elements.
Another question I see from the chat is how active is the alt-right in Western PA? Matt Rubin, I think, very rightly says the alt-right is active here, not as active as in the worst hotspots like Portland, but they absolutely exist here. They leaflet here, they hold demonstrations here, occasionally attempt to intimidate protesters here. I think Matt is completely on point with all of that. I would note, for example, that last weekend there was a Nazi concert in Pittsburgh, like explicitly like skinhead Nazi concert. So this is pretty common. Oakland tends to get postered by groups like the Proud Boys pretty regularly, and so they are around.
There was also a very small Nazi demonstration in Bloomfield a few months ago, I think around the peak of the Black Lives Matter movement. I remember seeing pictures of that circulating around. So there is unfortunately a presence here. Thankfully, it's not as large as it could be, but.
And like just one last point on this, the Tree of Life shooting and the person who did that, like this literally happened in our own backyard and was, I mean, we don't need to say more about that. We all know what happened, but that's, there's like lots of evidence that the shooter was heavily involved in white extremist movements and organizations. Yeah.
One other question that I saw a bit earlier was about sources. So I'm going to just say a couple sources and then I'll also throw them in the chat here. So if you're looking for more information, one of the best texts on the essay is a book by Daniel Siemens. It's called Stormtroopers, A New History of Hitler's Brown Shirts, which is a great text. If you want a queer perspective on the Stormtroopers, the podcast Bad Gays has an episode on Ernst Röhm, which is very excellent. I would also recommend for contemporary work, the 2 seasons of the podcast Bundyville is a very excellent resource for contemporary militia movements and the background there.
I see there's one, Ted, should this be the last question for time?
Yes, we are a good bit over, but hopefully we can catch back up. But let's just do one more question, and then the others can go and chat and things like that.
I just want to kind of answer Jacob's question about we could speak to the role of conspiracy culture in the rise of these. You're kind of alluding to a future event that PolEd is going to be putting on in the future on right-wing conspiracy theories, and we're going to be talking about QAnon and other interesting phenomenon like that. So we can't probably give you a good answer now, Jacob, but tune in for that and we'll give you plenty of info on the overlap between right-wing militia movements, conspiracy theories, internet culture, all that. It should be really good.
I only raised the point, well, for plenty of reasons, but like,
yeah,
because people clearly understand that the world is fucked up and like reacts to it in radical ways. And there is no mainstream explanation for why the world is fucked up. And that is something that like a space that I feel like socialists especially have to step into, because like liberalism can't explain like that like root emotional understanding in a way that socialism can. And it is something that, like, by omission, we are responsible for the rise of these people because we have not been able to get that message out. We have not been able to speak to our neighbors. And this stuff is salient all around us. That was a loaded ass question. So I was hoping you'd say that, but now I did.
Okay. There are a lot of requests for information about this and collecting links and things like this. So hopefully we can keep collecting that information and go forward. As Zanuck T has a thing about catalog here, so maybe that's some digital resources we can compile there. But we should move on as we are now at T plus 14 minutes.